Good evening, everyone. Not that we're trying to rush through this, but there might be a little bit of a baseball game left after we're done tonight. Good evening to all of you. My name is Gene Diedrich. I'm the CEO of Moneta Group, and on behalf of the 35 principals and their hardworking teams, I'd like to welcome you here tonight. I'd also like to thank Kate Pexa. Kate, where are you? Around here someplace, but Kate is our relationship manager from Schwab, great partners for us, and Kate is responsible for bringing our speaker here tonight. We appreciate the opportunity to serve you and your families as your family CFO. And I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank you for your business and our opportunity to serve you. We hope that we're doing a great job for you and meeting all your needs in that regard, and certainly happy to have a little help from the markets so far this year. Knock on something. So I can't remember a political election surrounded with so much anxiety. There just seems to be tension in the air, and several were commenting earlier this evening that last night's debate was just sort of a little snitting contest. So it's going to be an interesting next several weeks. We've had a steady stream of clients calling and saying, what do we do? Is there anything we should do different in terms of navigating around the election or the economic scenarios that are staring us in the face? And I wish we had a crystal ball, and I'm sorry to all of you that we can't look into that crystal ball and give you super solid advice on go this direction or go that direction. Nobody really knows. But I do know our speaker tonight is certainly more qualified than almost anyone to talk to us about what's going on. Greg Valliere is the chief political strategist for the Potomac Research Group, a nonpartisan group, I'm told, so it's important that you should know that. Greg, although he lives in San Francisco, I understand is a Nationals fan, and so we're sorry about that, Greg. Oh well, maybe next year. Greg has more than 30 years of experience covering Washington for investors. He coordinates political and economic research for the Potomac Group, and he focuses on the White House and Congress and how they shape fiscal policy, and he also monitors the Fed's interest rate policy. If Greg looks familiar to you, it's probably because you watch CNBC. He's an exclusive communicator for CNBC, frequently appearing on their shows Squawk Box, Power Lunch, The Closing Bell, and Kudlow and Company. So please join me in welcoming Greg Valliere.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Actually, I live in D.C., and the whole city was shocked that we could be up by 6-0 and lose a baseball game. It was very. I grew up as a Red Sox fan, so I'm sort of used to grief and misery. So yeah, it was. Well, congratulations to you guys. There's so much to talk about tonight, and I want to try to keep it to about 30 or 35 minutes. I don't think long dinner talks, evening talks they get a little tired after about 35 minutes. But I am going to talk about several very big themes. We'll have time for questions, and then afterwards I'm going to hang around if any of you want to have, arguments, whatever, with me on what's going on. Let me just say at the outset, as I always do, especially during this fascinating election season, is that I do not come here tonight to tell you that the left wing is correct or the right wing is correct. I don't think that's productive for investors. I'm not an advocate of one candidate or another. On most issues, I'm on the 50-yard line, but in truth, more than anything else, I'm a cynic after doing this for so many years. I'm almost a professional cynic. And my friend Kate and some other friends in the room have heard me explain how I finally got, with certainty, the knowledge that I'm more of a cynic than anything else. It happened in January when the Washington Post landed on my doorstep and I looked at the headline. It said, "Congressional job approval rating down to 9% positive." I looked at it and thought, wow, I wonder what that means for Boehner and Cantor and Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell. Then I looked again, wow, 9%. I wonder what that means for Pelosi or Harry Reid. Then I looked one more time and said, what were those 9% thinking? At that point, I think I realized I was a cynic more than anything else. So I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 big themes. We'll rip through them pretty quickly, but let me start, as I always do, with a quick overview of where I think the economy is. I'm very fortunate in that I get to work with a former Fed official, Don Cohn, who was the vice chairman of the Fed. Before that, I worked with Lyle Gramley. Both of them started their careers in Missouri at the Kansas City Fed. And I've gotten to know some other people at the Fed. And the first message I would give you tonight is that this is the most dovish, accommodative Fed in my career. It's not just Bernanke, who I'd say is fairly moderate. It's Janet Yellen, Bill Dudley in New York, Rosengren in Boston, Charlie Evans in Chicago, the new guy, Williams in San Francisco. This is a very dovish Fed that will keep rates extraordinarily low for a very long period of time. In fact, I joke that at some point after a policy meeting, they call it the FOMC, they'll put out a statement saying that the Fed funds rate will stay at 0 for the rest of our lives. I can almost see that coming. A very, very accommodative Fed. And when you look at how accommodative they are, you do have to ask the inevitable question, and I get it all the time as I travel around the country, and that is, could the Fed start to get a little more relaxed on inflation? Could they consider reflating? If you listen to Rick Santelli on CNBC and many others, there certainly is a conspiracy theory going around that the Fed may reflate. Well, my friend Don Cohn, who of course is very good friends with Ben Bernanke, reports that Bernanke is aghast at the idea that the Fed could give up its hard-earned reputation of being an inflation fighter. And I don't think Bernanke would have anything to do with any movement that would raise the inflation target. I just don't see it happening. I think the bigger problem is that at some point in the next 2-3 years, they're going to have to start unwinding their balance sheet, which is over $3 trillion that they've added to keep rates low. That could be messy. And they even concede in private that if they unwind the balance sheet during a period when the economy finally is growing, with interest rates headed higher, that would just be fuel to an environment already producing higher interest rates. I worry about that more than I worry about inflation. So why are they so dovish? The economy is growing, not very great, but it's growing. I think there are 2 or 3 reasons. The first would be a genuine feeling that the labor market has not healed. That number we got 2 weeks ago of 7.8, the government didn't cook the books, but there still is, I think, ample evidence that the labor market is not that strong and will stay fairly weak. A second reason is, of course, still anxiety over Europe. I would argue that in the last several months, the concerns over Europe have abated a bit because Mario Draghi, who's the European version of Ben Bernanke, will do whatever it takes. I worry that Draghi is maybe planting the seeds of inflation, but I think he'll do whatever it takes, and I think the euro will stay together with maybe Spain and Cyprus, Greece and Cyprus leaving. And I think most of Europe would say good riddance. I do think the Maginot Line is Spain, and that there will be a very strong effort to bail out Spain that will keep the euro in place. The other reason why I think the Fed is so dovish is the fiscal cliff. And I want to talk for a few minutes about what this fiscal cliff means, what it would do. Just a last comment on the Fed. There's an old cliche, as Gene and all of his colleagues know. I hate cliches, but this cliche happens to be true. You don't fight the Fed. Ben Bernanke is determined to goose the stock market, to keep stocks high, because a high stock market means better consumer confidence, and it's risen a lot in the last few months. If you have better consumer confidence, you get better consumer spending. So I think Bernanke is determined to do what it takes, and again, I think you do not fight the Fed. And that's an adage that has been proved time and time again. Well, as I said, one of the reasons they're concerned, one of the reasons they want to keep stimulating is this tremendous uncertainty surrounding the fiscal cliff. And I would argue that the fiscal cliff is already retarding economic growth. As I travel around the country, I hear anecdote after anecdote about businesses not spending money. They're sitting on record profits, but businesses aren't inclined to hire. They're not inclined to buy new plant and equipment because they don't know what tax rates are going to be in 2013. And I think that's a big impediment to growth. It's the major reason why we're stuck in a GDP growth path of about 1.5% to 2%. It's terrible. It should be a lot higher. I think the fiscal cliff is a factor. Now, I'd say at the outset, on the fiscal cliff, that this is the most incompetent, dysfunctional Congress I have ever seen in my career. You go down to Capitol Hill. I was not going for a gratuitous applause, but thank you. I think it's well deserved. But when I go down to Capitol Hill and talk to people and tell them, as many people in our industry tell them, about the consequences if we do nothing with the fiscal cliff, their response off the record is that they would rather use their best sound bites against the other party. They would rather use the fiscal cliff as a political toy to score cheap points rather than get anything done. So I think nothing will get done until after the election. I think it'll be early December before we get to work on the fiscal cliff. I thought it might be productive tonight to very quickly go through the 6 major components, because I find a lot of people here, what is the fiscal cliff? What does it mean? What does it consist of? So let me talk very quickly about what's in the fiscal cliff and handicap what might happen. The first 2 issues I think can be resolved in December. One is the so-called Medicare doc fix. I'm sure there's some physicians in the audience tonight. You know that Medicare has an annual increase in reimbursement. Usually it's done at the beginning of the year. They still haven't done it, but I think they'll get that done in December. The second part of the fiscal cliff involves the alternative minimum tax. And I'm sure there are many people in this room who, like me, hate the alternative minimum tax. I joke, I think I bought the Army a tank in the last few years because of the alternative minimum tax. Every year there's a fix. I mean, those of you who are financial planners or CPAs know that this fix keeps 20-some million people out of the AMT. It's done every year, usually in January. They still haven't done it. It's really expensive. Costs about $100 billion. But I think they will do it. I'm not sure they'll pay for it, but I think we'll get that second element of the fiscal cliff done in December. The third element of the fiscal cliff is something I think they will not do, and that would be still another extension of the payroll tax cut. I don't sense a lot of support for that in either party, and I think that by not extending it, it probably will somewhat detract from economic growth in 2013. The fourth part of the fiscal cliff is an area where we're going to catch a break. And that is, I and most people thought we would go through this horrible debate once again over extending the debt ceiling. Do you recall about 15 months ago, last July and August of a year ago, there was talk of a government default, there was talk of a credit rating downgrade, and we did get a downgrade, and finally they passed an extension of the debt ceiling, and most of us thought it would expire in December. Well, lo and behold, receipts have come in a little stronger to Treasury. Outlays haven't grown by quite as much as anticipated, and it now looks as if we can wait until late winter before we deal with the fiscal cliff. And it goes without saying, if Congress has the opportunity to defer something, they will. So that issue, I think we can not have to deal with in December. So now we're just down to 2 issues on the fiscal cliff. The next one is so-called sequestration. And what that means in English is that since the Deficit Supercommittee last November failed to come up with a deficit deal, as all committees fail to come up with a deficit deal, there are now mandated cuts on January 2nd of next year, about $110 billion, half on defense, half on domestic spending. Well, I can tell you right now, defense is not going to take a hit. That is not going to happen. There are no Republicans and virtually no Democrats who would agree to deep new cuts on defense. I'm beginning to think that domestic discretionary spending may not take a hit either. They're coming up with offsets, other spending cuts, maybe doing away with a few tax breaks like the ethanol break. So I don't think there'll be any big sequestration, any spending cuts in January. So you may be saying, what's the problem here? I mean, I've gone through 5 of the 6. I've told you how they can be deferred and dealt with. But then we come to the big one, the biggest one of all, and that obviously is, what do you do with the Bush tax cuts that expire on December 31st at midnight? If we don't do anything, as I'm sure many of you know, and I know Gene and all of his colleagues know, If we do nothing, we wake up on January 1 with more than a hangover. We wake up on January 1 with the top rate going from 35 back to the old top rate of 39.6, and all the other rates going up by 3 or 4 points. We wake up with the capital gains rate going from 15 to 20, plus 3.8. I always point out, people forget, as part of the Obama health care law, there's a 3.8% surtax on investment income for families that earn more than $250,000 a year. The dividend tax would go from 15% back to ordinary income, 39.6 plus 3.8. The estate tax exemption would go from $5 million all the way back to $1 million, and on and on and on. There would be many tax increases, leading most economists, like Bernanke or Mark Zandi, to say that the hit to the economy next year could be 3, 4, 5 percentage points, not percent, percentage points. So if we're only growing at 2% now to be charitable, a hit of that magnitude would drive the economy clearly into recession early next year. So what's going to happen? Well, like many things, I think it depends largely on who wins the election. If Romney wins, he has stated explicitly to Congress that he'd prefer they do nothing in December and wait until after his inauguration, which would be on January 20th. And I think then he would undo any tax hike. He would seek to reinstate the Bush tax cuts. And believe me, if any politician tells Congress they can do nothing, that's a request Congress can accommodate. So I think that you could see, if Romney wins, them deal with this pretty early in his presidency in February. If Obama wins, there are two scenarios on the fiscal cliff, in my opinion. One that's not great, the other that's not good at all. The first one would be, I've been told that Obama still wants to revive a grand compromise, like he talked about with Boehner 15 months ago, a deficit deal of $4 trillion. He mentions it in the debates. He says he wants to get it. I'm told there might be an effort to try to get a grand compromise. The idea that we could get a $4 trillion deal in the 3 weeks that they're back in December, to me is far-fetched, largely for one main reason, and it's a major point I want to leave with you tonight. A deal of that magnitude would have at least $1 trillion in new revenues, new taxes. The idea that could get through the House of John Boehner and Paul Ryan and Eric Cantor is ludicrous. There's no way in the world the House would agree to a big tax increase as part of any grand bargain in December. So I would argue, if he tries to get that, on Friday the 21st of December or Saturday the 22nd, they will break up in acrimony and say, gotta go, time for the holidays. And they will do what Congress does best. They will kick the can down the road and extend everything probably until the end of the first quarter. So we go through this BS all over again in the month of March, and I've talked to people on Capitol Hill who think they may extend this until the end of the second quarter. So we could go until July 1 without knowing for sure what taxes are going to look like. That's the good scenario if Obama wins. The really negative one, and I'd give this a 1 in 3, is that they break up in utter disarray on the 22nd of December and don't extend anything. And we wake up on January 1 with all these tax rates much higher, and then the president, if he's reelected, would proclaim in early January that he wants a big tax cut except for the rich. So he'd flip it around. He would seek to get a tax cut enacted. And then we'd have a big debate over what's rich. You know, the White House says $250,000 a year in family income is rich. If you live in a big city, have 3 kids in college, I'm not sure you'd say that's rich. Chuck Schumer of Brooklyn says it's $500,000. Nancy Pelosi of San Francisco says it's $1 million. So we'll have a long debate over what's rich. And in the meantime, if a deal does emerge, the House is going to balk, I think, on any kind of a deal that excludes some people from tax cuts. So we could have several months with the much higher rates in effect before we get any kind of a deal with tremendous uncertainty. The irony here is that I think the ultimate deal will be fairly benign. We're not going to go to 39.6 or ordinary income on dividends. That's not going to happen. I'm not aware of any Democrats who would want to do that. We're not going to have the estate tax exemption go from $5 million all the way back to $1 million. I don't think there's much support for that either. So I do think the final deal will be fairly benign, but the problem is this. It's the level of uncertainty that you cannot quantify. It's the fact that in 2-3 months, nobody really knows for sure, as Jean was saying, nobody is positive what's going to happen on taxes. And the best way I can sum it up is to give you an anecdote. I had a speech before a lovely group like this a few months ago, and an old-timer came up to me, probably 85 years old, old gentleman. He came up to me and said, "Young man," and I love it when anybody says, "young man." I was very pleased to hear that. He said, "Young man," he said, "I've got all these capital gains that I've accumulated over the decades. They're all very profitable, and I'm thinking, should I sell in November or December of this year, or can I wait until 2013 or beyond? Would rates be the same?" I couldn't answer him. I do this for a living, and I could not say, "Sir, you can wait," because I do think that 3.8 will stick, especially if Obama is reelected. And I can't rule out in a final deal later in the winter that the capital gains rate goes up to 20, along with the dividend rate. It's not out of the question. The House wouldn't like it, but they might have to accept it if they get their way on individual rates. So it's possible you could take this old fellow and multiply him by 7 or 8 or 9 million Americans who are starting to think the same way as we get into late 2012. And they may be saying to themselves, the capital gains rate right now could be the lowest we're going to see for a very, very long time. So to me, that's a prescription for some volatility as we head into the end of the year. I'm not smart enough to say how it would affect the markets, whether the markets go up or down. You can sell long-term assets and buy them right back the next day or the next hour. I understand that. But I do think this level of uncertainty adds an element of suspense to the markets as we get close to the end of this year. Now, some people say to me, well, you know, we're going to get a clear message in the election that'll give us direction on this. We'll get a signal from the voters which way they want to go. So as I move to my next big theme, I would say that this dysfunction and gridlock, in my opinion, could actually increase after this election. This is going to be such a close election. I increasingly think that this could be very close to the election of 2000. Hopefully not with hanging chads in Broward County. Hopefully not with a 1-month Supreme Court adjudication of some very emotional issues. But I do think this is going to be an exceptionally close race. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the two races, the race for the White House and the race for Congress, which is almost as interesting in many respects. Again, I'm not an advocate of either candidate, but I would say, and I have said for the last few months, that I think the Republicans have made a compelling case to fire Obama, but I'm not sure they've made a compelling case to hire Romney. I'm not quite sure they're there yet. They're getting closer, but I'm not sure he's, as we say, he's made the sale. This election has tightened dramatically, and in all the years I've followed politics, I rarely have seen the trajectory of an election shift as radically as it did after the debate in Denver. That was a really big deal. I say jokingly, I call this the caffeine debate, because I argue that Mitt Romney violated Mormon law and had about 8 espressos when he went into the debate. And I would argue that Barack Obama, for a few days before the debate, switched to decaf for reasons that I cannot quite figure out. And the polls after Denver were really quite striking, showing a pickup in momentum for Romney across the country. After last night, I think Obama probably stopped the bleeding. Both of them had their good points. There's a lot of buzz today about Romney saying things that upset a lot of women. I don't think it's going to ruin his chances, but I think the race is now back to a tie. When they went in last night, there were polls showing Romney ahead by 3 or 4 points nationwide, which is getting slightly outside the margin of error for poll takers. So I think it'll probably be tied over the weekend. Then we'll be down to 2 weeks. I'm not convinced that the final debate next Monday will be determinative. It'll be on foreign policy. I think Romney must regret that he didn't get in any blows on Benghazi. I thought Benghazi was one of the real Achilles heels for the White House. Romney had an opportunity. He didn't take it. He missed on a couple of other things. And the fact that Romney volunteered, he bullied his way to volunteer comments on his pension fund and Obama's pensions having investments in Asia, well, that just set up Obama for a comment that, well, I don't look at my pensions that much. They're not very big like yours. So Romney did a lot of things that did not help him, in my opinion. But I do think the race right now is essentially tied. So who's going to win? I've said for the last few months, and I say now with a real lack of conviction, that I still think that Obama is the slight, and I mean slight, favorite for two reasons. Number one is it's a little bit easier for him to get to 270. If you see Karl Rove and others who go on Fox and every network with their maps, Karl does a show on Monday on a special report with Brett Baer. And Karl gets out his map. Karl's at 230 or 240 for Obama. You only need 270. Obama has several paths to get to the 270. I was in Ohio this week. I was in Columbus on Monday. I was in Cleveland yesterday. And my sense from talking to a lot of smart people is that Obama is still probably ahead by a point or two in Ohio. A month ago, he was ahead by 7 or 8 in Ohio. But I do think if Ohio stays even narrowly in Obama's camp, it makes it a much easier path to get to 270. Because then you add maybe Iowa, maybe you add Nevada, Colorado. There's a lot of other swing states, whereas Romney has very little margin for error. He has to win in Virginia, where it's probably tied. He has to win North Carolina, where I think Romney is now ahead. And most importantly, he has to win Florida. If Romney loses Florida with 29 votes, we can go to bed at 9 o'clock on election night. He has to win the state of Florida. And I would say in this context, some people don't like me saying this, but I will say that I think the pick of Ryan complicates things for Romney in Florida. I know Ryan, I like him, I do TV with him. Ryan talks about issues that need to be discussed, but I said that Saturday morning when Ryan was picked that it would make it tougher for them to win Florida, and I have not changed my opinion on that for one major reason, and that is Paul Ryan scares my mother. When Ryan came up with his reform plan, my mother called me up and she said, Paul Ryan's going to cut my Medicare. This is 15 months ago. And I said, Mom, for Christ's sake, you're 88 years old. Nobody's going to cut your Medicare. No one's going to. And so then I went through an explanation of what Ryan would do. Nobody over the age of 55 would be affected. And I went through all the details. I thought it was a brilliant summary. My mother paused and said, Paul Ryan's going to cut my Medicare. So there's a lot of people, my mother's in New Hampshire, but there's a lot of people in Florida who grew up during the Depression who don't want anyone touching their Medicare or their Social Security. And here we are 2 weeks from the election, and Florida is still in dispute. I would have not said that 6 months ago. So while I think Ryan was a bold pick, I'm not sure it was a pick that would get them to win Florida. So the first reason I think Obama is still the very slight favorite is that it's a little easier for him to get to 270. The second reason is demographics. And there are two big stories there. One is the gender gap. A lot of people like my wife who are moderate couldn't decide who to vote for, but on social issues, it tipped the scales. And the fact that Ryan is close to this guy, Todd Akin, it was determinative. It was determinative for a lot of women. And I think the gender gap around the country is significant. The other demographic story is even more important, and that, of course, is Hispanic voters. 4 years ago, Obama got 67% of the Hispanic vote. I talked to someone in his campaign last week who thinks he'll go over 70% of the fastest growing demographic in America. I watched every Republican debate, and on several of them, I yelled at the TV, do you guys want to antagonize every Hispanic voter in America? Even Karl Rove has said that this is not smart because there are just so many Hispanic voters in places like Colorado. So in a close race, I think the demographics could be a factor as well. Could Romney still win? Absolutely. The race is tied. He's got plenty of money. He has the wild card issue of the fall, which is Benghazi. And I think Benghazi will be a big topic of debate for the next 2 weeks. I think it's a story the White House has not handled well, to say the least. Hillary Clinton proved she's the ultimate team player and took the hit on Benghazi, maybe because she still has some aspirations in 2016. I'm not sure what her thinking was, but we'll find out as books are written in the next 2 years why she did what she did. If Obama wins narrowly, let me say one other thing about the presidential race. Everybody asked me about the polls. Do you believe the polls? Are they biased? I've talked to poll takers, and off the record, they will tell you they're not sure they buy their own methodology. They don't know how many people you should be calling who are on cell phones versus landlines. They don't know how you really identify likely voters as opposed to registered voters. They certainly have an